Order. Can I ask Tonia Antoniazzi to move the motion, please?
Thank you, Sir Mark, and it is an honour to serve under your chairship. I beg to move that this House has considered e-petition 620264 relating to pay for teaching assistants. 88,410 people signed this petition, including 178 in my constituency. The committee received 22,506 responses to their survey, of which 84% were teaching assistants and 3% were former teaching assistants. 5% were teachers or head teachers and 4% were other staff who worked in a school. 2% were close friends or family members of a teaching assistant, and 1% were parents or guardians of a school-aged child. This issue is one that is particularly close to my heart, Sir Mark, because before I was elected as the member for Gower, I was a secondary school teacher and have worked with dozens of teaching assistants over my career. My career also included 8 years of working in the northwest of England in 4 different schools. I know firsthand how invaluable the support that they provide is to not just run in a classroom, but also in supporting pupils to achieve their full potential. But I've also seen how their roles over the years are dismissed and devalued. The last on the list when it comes to progression and development, but the first roles to be cut when budgets are. The expectation of unpaid after-hours work just to fill the gaps left by schools when they're cutting budgets and public services more broadly. And they provide key pastoral care and well-being support. And in far too many cases, they have to provide physical support when they are neither trained nor remunerated for this work. Now, this petition, Sir Mark, calls for the work teaching assistants do to be reflected in their pay. And before I discuss the issue specifically, I'd like to tell members more about the work teaching assistants do, as it is clear that the role they play in our schools is not fully understood. In fact, the government's own Opportunity for All, Strong Schools with Great Teachers for Your Child, white paper published in March 2022, only used the phrase teaching assistant twice and failed to mention their pay or progression. Teaching assistants take on a variety of roles, from ensuring students have nutritious meals in school or delivering structured interventions to help pupils progress, working and planning closely with classroom teachers and senior leaders. They play a key role in tackling inequalities and in improving attainment, especially for those pupils who are falling behind or have additional special learning needs or mental health needs, or who have behavioural issues. Research by the Education Endowment Foundation has found that teaching assistants who provide one-to-one or small group targeted interventions can result in pupils achieving between 4 and 6 additional months' progress on average. A 2019 research project for the DFE found that senior leaders placed a high value on the capacity of teaching assistants to improve classroom management and other staff workload pressures. But it's those same senior managers that reported that budget restraints saw teaching assistants being forced to do more and more without corresponding increases in pay. Teaching assistants are doing this work in an increasingly challenging environment. The impact of the pandemic, Sir Mark, is still being felt strongly in schools and across communities, with the crisis in children's mental health well-being being one of the starkest reminders to us all. There has been a 77% rise in the number of children needing specialist treatment for severe mental health crisis from April to October 2021, and that is compared with April to October 2019. In this context, the care and attention provided by teaching assistants is more vital than ever before. Research by the University of Portsmouth, commissioned by Unison, found that the COVID period had remade the teaching assistant's role, and that these likely changes are going to be long-lasting. The role has become even more varied, intense and emotionally demanding, with more support given to parents and carers and backfilling for specialist staff. And add to this the fact that there is a desperate lack of places in specialist schools. The role of a teaching assistant has become more and more complex. And also, there are many parents that wish for their child to have mainstream education and not be put in a specialist educational environment. And therefore, the role of a teaching assistant, and I've seen that firsthand, is really key for that inclusivity in all classrooms, in all schools across the United Kingdom. A Unison survey found that many teaching assistants were expected to provide medical as well as educational support. 27 of them reported providing physical therapy, 65% reported supporting with toileting and soiling incidents, and that's not just in primary school, and 7% were providing assistance with both catheters and colostomy bags. And while they provide this essential support, a Unison survey found that 48% of teaching assistants don't feel valued as a member of staff by their school. Reflecting this, there's a real concern about the experiences of teaching assistants that we just can't ignore. A University of Roehampton study which found that they were kicked, punched and spat at by pupils, with one interviewee experiencing a spinal injury and was forced to take early retirement. That's not the first case that I've heard throughout my teaching career. Some teaching assistants reported that violent students were given lesser sanctions for attacking them than they would receive for attacking teachers or senior managers. The prevalence of physical violence against teaching assistants, many of whom are women, risks normalising violence against women to children who are present, and as well as being entirely unacceptable to affected classroom staff. One teaching assistant responding to the committee survey said that the amount of children coming into mainstream school with behavioural problems is increasing, and some are very violent, which is hard to cope with both physically and mentally. It has an impact on the rest of the children in the class, and it disrupts their learning, and they also get very distressed. It falls on teaching assistants to work with these children with very little or any training. It's unfair on staff and children as there is no support for us. Working in these conditions, it can't be surprising to mark that nearly 50% of those surveyed by Unison are actively looking for better paid work. I know from my own experience that many of the women I worked with that were teaching assistants did move on to other work or had numerous jobs. Teaching assistants are some of the lowest paid public sector workers, sitting at the bottom of local government pay scales. And we know the majority of local authorities use the National Joint Council pay spine, and although academy trusts are not obligated to use this scale, some of them do. But the bottom end of the NJC pay spine is lower than the living wage. The mean salary of full and part-time teaching assistants in state-funded schools in England from 2020 to 2021 is only £19,000. However, one respondent to the committee's survey highlighted the reality of the pay for teaching assistants, saying, "Poor pay is now a real concern. Due to my hours being term time only, and this is pro rata over the year, I actually only bring home about £14,000, which is a very poor salary in today's situation. The average take-home salary for a teaching assistant is £14,211. And this, as I've said, is an issue which depends on your sex, because many women, mothers, find working in as a teaching assistant will fit in with their children and be convenient. But that's not what we want, a job of convenience. It has to be a job with pay progression and the right environment to work in. 92% of teaching assistants are women, as I've said, and the chronic undervaluing of what is being perceived as women's work has created this situation where key workers find themselves below the poverty line. So Mark, is it any wonder that along with nearly half of teaching assistants looking for new roles with better pay, 28% are having to take on second or third jobs to make ends meet, and 43% have to borrow money from family? The impact of low pay is amplified by the cost of living crisis, and particularly where we find ourselves today. In response to a 2022 survey by the GMB, one teaching assistant said, "It is very stressful trying to manage bills and food costs. We now wear extra layers and use hot water bottles as we are extremely worried about finding the money to pay the bills and not to get into debt." Members of the GMB report that they regularly pay for essential items such as food and toilet paper for the school and pupils out of their own pockets, something that pre-COVID, pre-being in this place, I saw happening all the time in all of my jobs as a teacher. But the survey also found that only 4% of the respondents agreed that my pay is keeping up with the cost of living crisis, because it isn't. And 66% said that they could not afford necessities for themselves each month, with 73% saying they could not even afford those necessities for their families. This response from one teaching assistant really does sum the issue up. We work at home unpaid to prepare resources, do research and training. We often stay late and arrive early, also unpaid. I would like our pay to reflect the role we do. I'm a mother of 3. Myself and my husband work full-time. I eat less to feed my children. I go without clothes, haircuts and non-essentials to make sure my children have all they need. Low wages don't only impact current teaching assistants. The disparity in these wages and other comparable work means schools are struggling to attract teaching assistants and to retain them. The Education Research, Innovation and Consultancy Unit was warned that there is a new emergency over teaching assistant recruitment and retention, which I know the Minister will be aware of. In 2020, it was reported that vacancy rates were higher for teaching assistants than for any other occupation. 90% of teaching assistants who responded to the committee survey said that they had considered leaving the role. One survey respondent who is a teacher or head teacher said, "Teaching assistants are one of the most important resources in my school. I am losing highly skilled, trained, experienced teaching assistants who are leaving to take up posts in supermarkets and other work which is paid better." And this is not to undermine the value of retail work, but it does highlight the impact of low wages on retaining, as another respondent says, amazing teaching assistants. Recent research by School Dash found that support staff vacancies are up by 85% compared to before the pandemic. Numerous other employers, from supermarkets to warehousing employers, are now offering variations on term-time-only contracts in a direct attempt to recruit school support staff on more competitive terms than schools can actually offer, and it shouldn't be a competition. In addition to low pay, they are also cut off from career development opportunities, as school support staff are ineligible for careers programmes, scholarships and the new National Professional Qualifications, which currently only apply to teachers, school leaders and SENCOs. Of course, the decisions we make about our education system should be driven by what's best for the pupils, and teaching assistants have an enormous positive impact on their attainment and experience. Teaching assistants are proven to improve classroom behaviour, and this can be especially true of those children who have all too often been let down by mainstream education. Teaching assistants are reported to be effective at lowering exclusion rates for particular groups, where they are often deployed to provide personal learning support, including pupils identified with SEND, poor mental health and Gypsy Roma traveller children. Despite this, teaching assistants are not eligible for the SEN allowance afforded to teachers. According to the Department of Education's own review of academic evidence, 91% of primary school teachers and 75% of secondary school teachers were very or fairly confident about the positive impact that support staff had on pupils' learning, and with other studies finding that teaching assistants can have a positive effect on children in our care. Our schooling system is severely underfunded, with real-term pay cuts The closing of services and the crumbling buildings, this is what we have to show for a decade of underinvestment in the future of our children. What our education system needs in the long term is a radical new approach to funding. But at a first step to that much needed reform, I can think of no better place to start than improving the salary and recognition of teaching assistants. I want to close my remarks, Sir Mark, with a teacher's quote from the committee's survey. Teaching assistants are all too often the only reason a student will stay in school. Their nurturing nature and patience is priceless. Their ability to break down work so a student can understand is phenomenal. Pay them what they deserve. Thank you, Sir Mark.
Thank you. The question is that this House has considered E-petition 620264 relating to pay for teaching assistants. I now call Robbie Walker.
Thank you, Chair. I wasn't planning to speak at length, but happy to speak briefly, just to say very welcome the Honourable Lady making the case for teaching assistants pay. I should declare a family interest as the brother of a teaching assistant who works in a special educational needs setting. And recognise the incredibly important work that they do, and I think she's encapsulated well. But what I wanted to highlight, and of course we would all like to see everyone in the education system better paid for what they do and their activity recognised, but what I want to highlight is the specific funding challenge that comes, particularly for our special educational needs schools, when it comes to the funding of teaching assistants. Now, in the recently announced pay offer, which I very strongly welcome, we saw an improvement to the usual situation with these pay offers, that it doesn't just cover schools, it also covers FE. That's very welcome. The challenge, though, is that when we have had governments successively funding teachers' pay, they haven't provided that same support for schools on teaching assistants' pay. And even the lower increases that we've seen through the local authority pay bands have not been funded by the Treasury and the Department for Education in the same way as the teachers' pay increases have over the years. That has increased the pressure on schools, and particularly special educational needs schools such as Fort Royal Primary School in my constituency, who have to, quite rightly, in order to meet need, employ a very large number of teaching assistants. Now, I know that my honourable friend on the front bench will quite rightly point out that the government has more than doubled high needs funding, and I welcome that. And I know that there is significantly more money going into this area, but that doubling of funding is in response to demand. It is response to what the Children's Minister has acknowledged is a rising level of need in our schools. And I speak in this rate really to urge my honourable friend to consider how, particularly with our special educational needs schools, but also with our mainstream schools that are supporting more and more children with SEN, we can make sure that in future, when pay awards are announced, those reach for teaching assistants, and crucially, that they are fully and properly funded, because otherwise we will have a situation where, in order to meet the commitments that they have on teachers' pay and on other areas where they want to support investment, schools unfortunately have to cut back on the very important work of teaching assistants. And I join the Honourable Lady in recognising the quality, the quantity of that work, the range of work, the important role that teaching assistants play in supporting inclusion. And when we're dealing, and as a select committee, looking at this issue of persistent absence in school, inclusion is crucial. Making sure that children's needs are met is a crucial part of ensuring that they can continue to attend in school. I don't pretend this is an easy area, and just on one small point of defence on the white paper, which I co-wrote, it did, of course, mention the work of teaching assistants, as she points out in a couple of areas. It also talked about apprenticeships and degree apprenticeships, which I think are a real opportunity to build a route for progression for teaching assistants. And I've seen some very interesting schools where actually they've been taking teaching assistants, sports assistants, and meal assistants as well, and finding those who are able to and excited to move up into the teaching profession, providing the support and providing a route for progression further. I would love the government to look at what further routes of progression can be built for teaching assistants so that more of them can go on. Perhaps when the children have grown up and flown the nest, as is the case in my sister's case, can go on into a career in teaching. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Tim Farron.
Thank you, Sir Mark. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship this afternoon, and want to congratulate the Honourable Member for Gower for making a really excellent speech, and to thank those people who signed the petition. 1,000 or more in Cumbria signed this petition, which might reflect the fact that we are a community of many, many schools, not least because of the rural nature of much of Cumbria. It means that many of those schools are very small. In my visits around Westmoreland in recent weeks and months, I've been to primary schools with as many as 450 children and with as few as 13, and all points in between. And the value of teaching assistants in each of those schools, at primary school, a high school, and indeed in special educational needs schools as well, is immense, and it's important we recognise that. And if we, I hope we can achieve much more than this. One thing at least I hope we can achieve from this debate is to put on record our collective gratitude across all sides of this House to those people who choose to enter this profession. And the value of teaching assistants is immense in assisting, genuinely, of course, as you might expect from the title of the profession, teachers to teach. If you're dealing with 30 children, let's say, and you have every range of abilities within that class, then having teaching assistants to allow teachers to focus upon the delivery of the subject matter, and then to get alongside those children whether they are ahead or behind or in the middle of the pack at that particular time is of enormous and transformational value, as we've heard, in terms of their ability to succeed later in life. And indeed, particularly at primary school level, to get a love of learning, to understand how to learn at least to some small degree independently, and then go on to be able to learn with a greater level of maturity once they get to higher education. So their qualities are immense, their value is immense, and they're not well paid, Sir Mark, as we've heard. And the Honourable Member for the Gower read out a number of statistics which are really powerful, and I hope that people pay attention to them. Perhaps one of the most powerful ones is that whilst I think the median or average wage of a teaching assistant is around £19,000 a year, many of them are term time only, some of them by their own choice, some of them because of budgetary constraints of their schools, which mean for those teaching assistants, their average income is just over £14,000. And now that is going to have an even bigger impact in the more expensive places to stay. So I want to make a particular case for the Minister here to bear in mind how things are for us in Westmoreland and Furness. We're a community where we're looking at an average house price of more than 12.5 times the average household income. We've seen in the last 3 years the almost evaporation of the long-term private rented sector into Airbnb. And what that has meant, along with the steady rise of second home ownership gobbling up the housing market in much of the lakes and the dales, it basically means that the amount of housing that is remotely affordable or available for people on anything other than a staggering salary, well, it's not there anymore. So it's not just teaching assistants, it's people working in care, in hospitality and tourism, and every other profession. And we have a massive workforce crisis, but it is seen very, very clearly at school by school when it comes to teaching assistants. Westmoreland and Furness Council receives no provision, neither do other councils similar to ours, to acknowledge the fact that the gap between average wages and average house prices, and indeed rental prices, is so vast, and therefore means that we're just starved of a workforce. And so we're very, very grateful for every one of those people who chooses to work within the profession. We've also heard, and rightly I think, the issue of career progression raised. Because for anybody in any role, if they don't feel any way up or through that profession into a higher level of qualification, potentially even becoming a qualified teacher themselves at some point, then you're going to limit you're going to affect the morale. You're going to affect your ability to retain those people within the profession. And we see that school by school, and I'm sure constituency by constituency, as people who have got great qualities and have got the ability to add even more value to their communities, being stymied and reaching a kind of glass ceiling, and therefore leaving the profession altogether. We of course see people leaving the industry, leaving education because of salaries. I think in particular in my own communities, because of the great pressure on our workforce for a variety of reasons. I've mentioned one of them, housing, but there are others as well. Nearly 2/3 of the hospitality and tourism businesses in my patch are operating below capacity because they haven't got enough staff. And that means those who've got the wherewithal can therefore increase their terms and conditions, that's great, and their salaries, and that's great. But it's teaching assistants and care workers and others who are the pool of labour who are being redistributed, should we say, into the private sector away from teaching assistant roles and care assistant roles, and we are suffering as a consequence of that. Obviously, the number one issue, I say obviously, I think most members here would certainly be obvious to them. The number one issue I hear when I go to schools, and I've been to lots recently. I'll just run through a few. I've been to many of the schools in Kendal. I've been to Brough, to T-Bay, to Kirby Stephen, to Appleby, Great Asby, Clifton, Witherslack, Shap, Windermere, Crosby Ravensworth, Kirby Lonsdale and Crosthwaite, just in the last few weeks. The number one issue that's raised is the issue of salaries and pay and where that money comes from. And the fact is that the rising energy costs that have not been funded through through central or indeed local authority funding, but teachers' pay awards, which are overdue and insufficient, nevertheless, schools are not funded to pay for those. The current pay offer looks like about 6.5%, and that probably more than half of that will have to be funded from within school budgets. And they can't find them. And if you are a school, what can you do? You can't put the price up of anything. There's no way of you being able to commercially increase your revenue some way. What do? You're going to pay those teachers the extra pay award, of course you are. And so, well, you'll have to cut other staff. And that's very often teaching assistants. So I'm afraid we're in a situation where it looks like schools are having to pit teachers' pay awards against having teaching assistants at all. And these folks who are on low wages but doing immense work are being let go. I can't think of a single school that's not at least contemplating doing that in my part of Cumbria. So I'd simply ask the Minister to think very carefully about the impact upon children of having teaching assistants that are either demoralised or having to take second and third jobs just to keep themselves going, or more likely just leave the profession altogether, and what that means for the quality of education that will be delivered, what it means for the stress levels and the capabilities of our teachers who will be left behind having to deal with large classes but without any help whatsoever, what it means especially for children with special educational needs. We know how long it takes for an EHCP to be arrived at these days. Schools and teaching assistants within schools are kind of carrying that load until an EHCP is provided. And even when one is produced, schools will be coming up with the first £6,000 of the cost of that in the first place, which means teaching assistants, again, spending time with children who have the greatest level of need. If we want them to thrive, then we need to make sure we invest in them with people who are well enough paid to keep them in that profession long time. All I would say really in conclusion, Sir Mark, is that if the Minister is going to take this issue seriously and do more than just pay lip service to how much we value teaching assistants, then he will ensure that schools are adequately funded for the pay rises they're asked to make, so they can therefore keep the staff they currently have, as well as pay those staff adequately and properly. He will ensure that we look at authorities like mine, where you've got huge cost of living disparities, which means we're losing our workforce of all kinds and therefore losing teaching assistants. So special alterations to formula for Westmoreland and Furness so that our schools can pay teaching assistants adequately so they can afford a place to live. And then finally, as has been said on both sides, that we really ought to be looking at ways in which we retain our teaching assistants by valuing them, by creating a career structure, ability to progress into the teaching profession directly, including that as one of those things which are on the table for them. But in the end, let us value our teaching assistants by more than what we say, but by what we do also. Thank you.
All right, thank you. We now move to front bench contributions. I call Stephen Morgan.
Sir Mark, it is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I'd like to begin by thanking my honourable friend, the member for Gower, for opening this debate. I'd also like to thank all those that signed a petition to bring this pressing matter to our attention and pay tribute to all teaching assistants and school support staff across the country for their hard work and dedication. Their essential support is invaluable in shaping the lives and futures of our children. My honourable friend, the member for Gower, spoke with real insight and expertise as a former teacher about the challenges teaching assistants face and the invaluable role that TAs play in schools, tackling inequalities, supporting children falling behind, improving progress, helping with mental health interventions. And I also am very grateful for her contributions based on research and evidence, especially, obviously, the University of Portsmouth, and in particular on the conditions as a result of the pandemic, including the concerning levels of physical assault. I thank her again for tabling this debate and for her excellent speech. So Mark, the quality of teaching is the most important influence on improving children's outcomes and delivering them a high-quality education. And as we know, teaching assistants are an essential part of this, from offering supervision and encouragement to pupils to supporting teachers and assisting classroom management to organising and assisting extracurricular activities, as well as breaks and lunchtimes. TAs help to create a conducive environment for effective teaching and learning, and are a fundamental part of our education system. And I'd also like to pay tribute to the extraordinary dedication of teaching assistants during the COVID pandemic, supporting vulnerable children and the children of key workers. It is difficult to see how our school system would have managed without them. Now, unfortunately, despite the integral role that they play, TAs and the wider teaching profession have been consistently overlooked and undervalued by this government. According to a survey this year by the NEU, 3 out of 4 TAs are routinely working out of contract hours, and nearly half undertake cover supervision. And increasingly, we're hearing stories of TAs leaving the profession to take up better paid jobs elsewhere, as my honourable friend for Gower stated earlier. And even more worryingly, support staff are turning to food banks, as confirmed by the charity Education Support in TES today, to cope with the cost of living crisis and increasing rate. Yet, as I've witnessed firsthand from visiting schools across the country, and despite these struggles, many teaching assistants are still helping struggling pupils from their own pocket with food, uniform and school supply costs. Now, Sir Mark, it's no surprise that school support staff vacancies have almost doubled since the start of the pandemic, with schools forced to turn to supply teaching assistants from recruitment agencies to fill these vacancies, eating further into their tight budgets, with recent analysis by my party finding that schools spent £8 billion in such fees since 2010. Support staff shortages hit areas with more poorer pupils the hardest, as these are often the schools with larger class sizes and the most need for individualised support. Now, the loss of school support staff also disproportionately impacts students with special educational needs, as we heard earlier, who rely on that vital one-to-one support and are often in the need of additional pastoral care. Since 2010, TAs have been pushed into responsibilities that go way beyond their contract and job description, often picking up the pieces for overstretched teachers, acting as cover, or stepping in for school nurses. Cuts to youth services and wraparound services since 2010 have also placed a heavy burden on schools. And in the midst of a mental health crisis among our young people, TAs are often out of their depth and overwhelmed. Morale in the sector has not helped when senior government ministers describe school support staff in derogatory terms, and when the Education Secretary refuses to confront reality and says that reports of teaching assistants leaving for supermarket jobs are untrue. Now, Sir Mark, when you factor in the increased stress alongside the erosion of pay and conditions, it's not a mystery why many teaching assistants are looking elsewhere for work. Now, while the government does not directly determine pay of TAs in all schools, it is responsible for investing in authorities and schools that often decide the pay scale. And the impact of the government's inability to grow the economy and run our public services effectively has had a clear impact. In schools, budgets still remain below 2010 levels, and when budgets are extremely tight, teaching assistants, much to their regret of the school leadership, are often the first jobs to be cut. The impact of these cuts are felt across the school, but mostly by those children who need the support the most, which is likely to be part of the reason why the attainment gap is widening at all stages of children's learning, and it's now at the widest point in a decade. However, Sir Mark, Labour is determined to fix this. We will do this by tackling the recruitment and retention crisis issues with school leaders head-on, ensuring that every child has world-class teaching, by valuing rather than belittling the teaching profession, supporting teaching staff to develop as experts in their field, and recognising and respecting the work of our school support staff who deliver crucial learning support, especially for children who face the greatest barriers to engaging with education. Once again, making teachers and TAs feel valued and appreciated for the work that they do. We will work with schools and school leaders to tackle the workloads, expanding the workforce to deliver optimal support for pupils and alleviate strain on staff, which will also be aided by reforming Ofsted. And the next Labour government will provide better working conditions for all workers, including teaching assistants. We want to learn from other professions on how they structure pay, progression and ongoing training to attract and retain the workforce. Our new deal for working people will ensure fair pay and job security for all. And we will value every worker and make sure their skills and expertise are acknowledged and appreciated. We will also provide better training and support structures to make sure that workers are not pushed out of bounds of their contract. So Mark, to ensure children receive the best possible education, it is crucial that we stand behind those who support them. Teaching assistants deserve to be treated fairly and paid fairly. They deserve to be respected, trusted and appreciated by a government who recognises the sacrifices that they've made and continue to make to support children across the country who face the greatest barriers to learning. What they do not deserve is to be overstretched and undervalued by a government which doesn't prioritise their needs, because the impact on children's learning of this adversarial attitude has been clear to see. Therefore, in his response today, I hope the Minister will outline what his government department is doing to tackle the growing number of vacancies amongst school support staff, to retain the excellent teaching assistants currently supporting children across our country's schools, and to once again make the role of teaching assistant valued and respected as it was under the last Labour government. I look forward to hearing the Minister's response. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all speakers for contributing to today's debate.
Thank you. I call the Minister Nick Gibb.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. It's a pleasure to take part in this debate under your chairship, Sir Martin. I'd like to congratulate the Honourable Lady, the member for Gower, on her well-informed and passionate speech opening this debate today on the petition relating to pay for teaching assistants. I'd like to start by saying that the government recognises teaching assistants as a valuable part of the school workforce. We appreciate the dedication of our teaching assistants and we know the valuable contribution they make to pupils' education alongside excellent teachers. The department recently published data on the number of teaching assistants through the school workforce census, which showed that there are now 281,000 full-time equivalent teaching assistants in schools, and this is an increase of 5,300 since 2021. Teaching assistants now make up 3 in 10 of the school workforce overall, accounting for 37% of the nursery and primary workforce, 14% of the secondary workforce, and 52% of the special school workforce. And we know that when teaching assistants are well trained and well deployed, they can improve pupil attainment. Evidence from the Education Endowment Foundation found that teaching assistants can add up to 4 months improvement in pupil progress when delivering one-to-one or small group support using structured interventions, as the Honourable Member pointed out in her opening speech. And that's why we set out in the SEND and AP Green Paper our intention to develop a longer-term approach for teaching assistants to ensure that their impact is more consistent across the system and that they can specialise in interventions that are proven to work. Happy to give way to the Honourable Member.
I thank the Minister for giving way, and I hope he will indulge me in what I want to say. When I was teaching, I had a young man called Jack Richards, who was a wheelchair user and non-verbal. He used an eye gaze in my classroom. He was well supported by his teaching assistants, Hayley and Joanne. And he learned French from the year 7 to year 11. Unfortunately, was unable to sit the GCSE exam. But that gift that they gave him in preparing and supporting me to prepare resources for an eye gaze to teach a young man French was absolutely magic. And also he participated fully, and this is a mainstream 11 to 16 school, participated fully as well. If I say fully, he was able to come on the trips to France and everything. That is how magic his experience was in school, that he was able to be in my classroom and to participate. And that is just how wonderful they are. And I hope that he hears of more examples like that, because it really was an honour and a privilege to be able to teach him. Thanks to them.
Delighted that the Honourable Member was able to put that on the record, and I hope that the teaching assistant you mentioned will be able to see that in Hansard. And what we want is for those examples to be more consistent right across the country. And so the department already provides support for teaching assistants through a number of programs. And this includes training to improve maths for teaching assistants through the maths hubs, and training to support teaching assistants to identify and meet the needs of children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities through the Universal Services Programme. And we're also pioneering innovative practice through the Early Language and Support for Every Child pilot to trial new ways of working to better identify and support children with speech, language and communication needs in early years and primary schools. Now, the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education, IFATE, also recently published a revised Level 3 Teaching Assistant Apprenticeship developed by employers, which became available for delivery from the 6th of May this year. And schools will be able to access up to £7,000 of levy funding to train and upskill teaching assistants. Now, schools are free, of course, to set terms and conditions for teaching assistants and support staff according to their own circumstances. Local government employees, including school support staff, are covered by the National Joint Council Terms and Conditions, known as the Green Book. And most schools, including academies, use the local government pay scales in conjunction with the Green Book. Now, local government pay scales are set through negotiation between the Local Government Association, representing the employer, and local government trade unions, Unison, Unite, and the GMB, which represent the employee. And central government does not have any formal role in these matters. There is currently a generous offer on the table for employees covered by local government pay scales. The offer for 23-24 is a flat cash uplift of £1,925 from the 1st of April 2023. And this is the same uplift that was agreed for the 2022-23 pay deal. If accepted, this would equate to an increase of 9.42% this year for those on the lowest pay scale, and an increase of £4,033, or 22%, over the 2 years since April 2021. We also know, Sir Mark, that schools can and do pay teaching assistants more than those on the lowest pay scale, currently earning £20,441 per annum. It's disappointing that the unions have rejected this offer, which would provide certainty for staff who are waiting to see an increase to the size of their pay packets. And I hope that the pay award can be settled without the use of strike action, as we know that will impact children's education and cause disruption for parents. Now, the government understands the pressures people are facing with the cost of living, which is why we are providing £94 billion of support to households with higher costs across 2022-23 and the 23-24 financial years, equivalent to £3,300 per household on average. Now, points have been raised in this debate, Sir Mark, about the ability of schools to pay for teaching assistants, particularly in light of the recent pay award. Now, the government is committed to providing a world-class education for all children and has invested significantly in schools to achieve that. The 2022 autumn statement announced an additional £2 billion in each of the 23-24 and the 2024-25 years, over and above totals announced in the spending review in 2021. And in response to the issues raised by the Honourable Member for Westmoreland and Lonsdale, the pay award announced last week is fully funded. Last week we announced an additional £525 million this year to support schools with the Teachers' Pay Award, and with a further £900 million in 2024-25. And this means that funding for mainstream schools and special needs is more than £3.9 billion higher this year compared to last year. And that's on top of the £4 billion cash increase last year, an increase of 16% over those 2 years. And we submitted detailed evidence of the school's costs to the STRB, the pay body, and setting out that the first 3.5% of the pay award is already funded by that £3.5 billion increase in school funding, and which also included a very pessimistic assumption about energy costs, which again the Honourable Member raised. And so those are covered by the £3.5 billion increase in school funding, and then the extra 3%, between 3.5 and 6.5, is the funding that I just announced of the £525 million this year and £900 million next year. And the unions have acknowledged that the pay award has been properly funded. Now, next year, Sir Mark, as a result of that, schools funding will be more than £59.6 billion, the highest ever level of school funding and the highest ever level in real terms as well, and in real terms per pupil, as measured by the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Schools are expected to use their core budgets to pay for staff, including teaching assistants, and they may use local government pay scales when setting pay. Now, the department's affordability calculation for schools takes account of the latest pay offer to teaching assistants. The petition highlighted the importance of teaching assistants supporting children with special educational needs and disabilities, and I'd like to reiterate the importance of teaching assistants providing support to these pupils and outline our commitment to ensuring that these pupils receive the support they need. High needs funding for children and young people with complex special educational needs and disabilities will be rising to £10.1 billion in this financial year, 2023-24. That's an increase of over 50% from the 2019-2020 allocations. And on top of this funding, special and AP schools are receiving an additional £50 million in 2023-24 through the Teachers' Pay annual grant to support schools with their staffing costs. Now, for pupils with SEND, schools are expected to meet additional support costs of up to £6,000 per pupil from their core budgets. And schools can then seek additional funding from local authorities' high needs budgets. And local authorities usually assess the need for extra funding through the EHC, the Education, Health and Care Needs Assessment process. And if a pupil does have an EHC plan, then the local authority has a duty to secure their special educational provision, which will often include a teaching assistant. And if the cost of this provision exceeds £6,000 per pupil, this will be paid for from the local authority's high needs budget, which, as I've said, has increased considerably over the last few years. On the 2nd of March, we published the SEND and AP Improvement Plan in response to the Green Paper, and this outlines the government's mission for special educational needs and alternative provision system to fulfil children's potential, to build parents' trust, and to provide financial stability. And as I outlined earlier, we intend to develop a longer-term approach for teaching assistants to ensure that their impact is consistent across the system and the different responsibilities they take on. We want teaching assistants to be well-trained and to be able to develop specific expertise, for example, in speech and language interventions. And as a first step, we have commissioned a research project to develop our evidence base on current school approaches, demand and best practice. Now, the research is being conducted by YouGov and CFE Research, with findings due by the end of the year. So, Sir Mark, in conclusion, the government values teaching assistants and the role they play alongside excellent teachers. We recognise the positive impact they can have on pupil outcomes when well deployed and well trained. And I've set out that we will be developing a longer term approach to ensure that this is the case and that the impact of teaching assistants is more consistent across the system. And the first step we're taking is to improve our evidence base through the research project which is currently in the field. Schools are best placed to recruit and pay teaching assistants according to their own needs, which is why central government does not have a role setting pay for teaching assistants or other school support staff. Many schools, including academies, pay teaching assistants according to local government pay scales, and if the pay offer for local government employees is accepted for 23-24, it would see the lowest paid earning 22% more than they did in April 2021. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Minister. I'd like to call Tonia Antoniazzi to respond.
Thank you, Sir Mark. I'll keep my comments brief. I believe there is need for reform. I believe that our teaching assistants deserve better, and there should be a real focus on recruitment and retention. I appreciate I am from Wales, and the issues are similar across the United Kingdom. Therefore, this is something that we should all stand together, work together, and look to improve our recruitment and retention and our pay for those who in our schools play a vital role. Thank you, Sir Mark.
Okay, the question is that this House has considered E-petition 620264 relating to pay for teaching assistants. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. The ayes have it, the ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting stands adjourned. Thank you.
Oh, I could have talked for another hour.